Welcome to Learn with Roblox. In today's video, we're going to talk about SOH CAH TOA and how you can use it to find sides in a right triangle. So what is SOH CAH TOA? To explain SOH CAH TOA, I need to draw a right triangle and label the sides and angles in it. So if I take this right triangle down here and label this angle and call it theta, I can label some of the sides now. So the side that is opposite the right angle, we'll call that the hypotenuse, or H for short. The side that is right next to the angle, I'll call it the adjacent side, or A for short. And the side that is farthest away from this angle, we'll call that the opposite side, or O for short. Now I can explain what SOH CAH TOA means. So if we take SO in SOH CAH TOA, the S stands for the sine. And all it is saying is that the sine of the angle is equal to the opposite side, O, divided by H, the hypotenuse. Now I can explain what the CA means, and the C stands for cosine, call that cos for short. And that's equal to the adjacent side A, divided by H, the hypotenuse. And finally, what does TOA mean? Well, the T stands for tangent, or I'll call it tan for short. And that is equal to the opposite side, O, divided by A, which is the adjacent side. And we can use these three formulas, or these three relations, to help us solve for sides in a right triangle. And I just want to make a final note that you have to do this in a right triangle. If you try and do this in any triangle, like an equilateral triangle or an acute or obtuse triangle, it is not going to work. It has to be a right triangle. Let's take a look at a few problems now to better understand this idea. In this first problem, we have a right triangle with an angle of 34 degrees and side lengths of x and 7. And how can we solve for x? So the first thing we need to do is we need to label these sides in relation to the angle so we can figure out what part of SOH CAH TOA to use. So let's take a look at this x here. What is x? Well, I want to know that it is opposite to the right angle. Any side that is opposite to the right angle in a triangle is going to be called hypotenuse. So I'm going to call this h. And then now we have this 7 and it is across from that 34-degree angle. So because it is directly across from a 34-degree angle, it is the farthest away, and therefore we'll call it the opposite side. So we'll call it O. Now what trig function relates O and h? Well, remember SOH CAH TOA? That sounds like the SO in SOH CAH TOA. So therefore, what trig function are we going to use? Well, the S stands for sine. So we're going to use sine to help us solve this problem. Now let's write sine of the angle. And we already know the angle. It is 34 degrees, right? And what does SOH CAH TOA tell us? Remember, well, SOH CAH TOA tells us that sine is equal to the opposite over the hypotenuse. And the thing is, we know what the opposite and the hypotenuse are. O is just 7, and H is just x. Now look, we have an equation we can use to solve for x. So how can we solve for x? The first thing I'm going to do is multiply by x on both sides because x is in the denominator. So now if I do that, I'm going to get x times sine of 34 is equal to 7. Now how do I isolate x? Well, because we're multiplying by sine 34 on the left side, let's divide by sine 34 on both sides. So now the sine 34s will cancel out on the left side, and I'm going to be left with x is equal to 7 divided by sine of 34. And we can just compute this now on a calculator. So first, if you calculate sine of 34, that ends up being about 0.559. And now just do 7 divided by 0.559 on a calculator. If you do that, you're going to get that x is equal to 12.5. And that's how we can use SOH CAH TOA to find x in this case. Let's go on to a different problem. So in this problem, we have a triangle with side lengths of 16 and y and an angle of 43 degrees. Let's use SOH CAH TOA to solve for y in this triangle. So the first thing you want to do in any right triangle problem is you want to figure out what the sides are in relation to the angle so we can figure out which part of SOH CAH TOA to use. So first, this 16 over here, I want you to notice is the hypotenuse, right? Because it is opposite to that right angle. So I'm just going to call this h because it's our hypotenuse side. And for this y, notice that this y is directly opposite to that 43-degree angle. So because it's opposite to that 43 degrees, let's call it O for the opposite side. So now, in SOH CAH TOA, which one relates O and h? Well, the answer is SO. That one has O and h in it, so let's use sine for this problem. So what does SOH CAH TOA tells us? It tells us that the sine of the angle, which we know is 43 in this case, is equal to O over h. And I know what O and H are. O is just y, and h is just 16. And now this is an equation that we can solve. So the first thing I'm going to do is multiply by 16 on both sides so I can cancel it out in the denominator like this. And then I'm going to be left with y is equal to 16 times sine of 43. And now you can just compute this on a calculator. Let's first do sine of 43 on a calculator. Sine of 43 degrees, and make sure your calculator is in degrees and not radians, is equal to 0.682. And I'll just do 16 times 0.682 to solve for y. If you do that, you should get that y is equal to 10.91. And that is the answer to this problem. Let's try and solve for z in this right triangle over here. So we have a triangle with side lengths of 67, z, and an angle of 56 degrees. And we know it's a right triangle, so we can use SOH CAH TOA to solve for z. So the first thing we want to do is label 67 and z and determine whether they're the hypotenuse, opposite, or adjacent side relative to that 56-degree angle we're given. So let's start with z. Well, it's not the hypotenuse because it's not across from that right angle. And because it's right next to that 56 degrees, it's the adjacent side, or I'll call it A. What about this 67 over here? Well, it's not the hypotenuse and it's not the adjacent. And notice that it's all the way across from that 56 degrees. Therefore, it is O, the opposite side. So now, what trig function relates the opposite and the adjacent side? Well, if you do SOH CAH TOA, well, the trig function that relates the opposite and the adjacent is tangent. These won't cut it. So we got to use tangent for this problem. So now let's write down what TOA means. This means that tangent, and our angle is 56 degrees, so tangent of 56 degrees is equal to O over A, because that's TOA in SOH CAH TOA. And the O is 67, and the A is Z. So I can replace this with 67 divided by Z. Now to solve for Z, let's multiply by Z on both sides. That'll cancel out the Z in the denominator, and I'm going to be left with 67 is equal to Z times tangent of 56. Now, just divide by tangent of 56 on both sides to isolate that Z. And if you do that, we're going to get that Z is equal to 67 divided by tangent of 56. So now just put tangent of 56 degrees into your calculator, and you should find that it's equal to 1.483. Now just do 67 divided by 1.483. If you do that, you'll find that Z is equal to 45.18. And that is our answer to this problem. Let's solve for x in this right triangle. So we have a triangle with side lengths of x, 4, and an angle of 33 degrees, and we know it's a right triangle, so we can use SOH CAH TOA. So the first thing to do is to label x and 4 relative to that 33-degree angle to know whether we use sine, cosine, or tangent for this problem. So 4 is the adjacent side, and how can I figure that out so fast? Well, notice that it is right next to that 33-degree angle. It is touching that 33-degree angle, and it's not the hypotenuse because it's not opposite from the right angle. Therefore, it must be the adjacent. And then for x must be the opposite side because this is the hypotenuse over here, this is the adjacent, and that leaves O for x. And notice that x is opposite from 33 degrees, so that's another way that you know is the opposite side. So what trig function relates the opposite and the adjacent sides in a triangle? Well, think of SOH CAH TOA. I think TOA fits that pretty well. Therefore, tangent is the operation we use. So now let's write our expression for tangent. So we have tangent of 33 degrees, because that's the angle in this problem, is equal to what? Is equal to O over A, TOA, right? And then we know that the opposite is x, and the adjacent is 4. So therefore, tangent of 33 degrees is equal to x divided by 4. And if we solve this equation for x, we will get our answer for x. So let's multiply by 4 on both sides. And that'll get rid of the 4 in the denominator over there. And I'll be left with x is equal to 4 times tan 33 degrees. So now put tangent of 33 degrees into a calculator. If you do that, you should get that it is equal to 0.649. Now just do 4 times 0.649 on a calculator. And if you do that, you should get x is equal to 2.60. And that is our answer to this problem. Here we have a right triangle with side lengths of 41 and x and an angle of 46 degrees between them, and this is a right triangle. So how can we solve for x? First thing you want to do in any problem like this is label the sides 41 and x to find out whether they're the hypotenuse, adjacent, or opposites. And then that'll tell us whether we use sine, cosine, or tangent to solve this problem. So first, know that for x is the hypotenuse, and that's because it is opposite to that right angle. Now what about 41? Notice that 41 is right next to that 46 degree angle. It's right there, and it makes up one of the sides of that 46 degree angle. Therefore, we can call 41 the adjacent side, or A for short. So now, what trig function relates to the adjacent and hypotenuse sides of a triangle? Well, think of SOH CAH TOA. I think CAH fits that pretty well, and CAH has cosine in it. So cosine is the function we're going to use. So let's write that down. Cosine of the angle in this problem, 46 degrees, is equal to A over H. A is just 41, and X is just H, our hypotenuse. So now we can solve this equation. We have cosine of 46 is equal to 41 divided by X. Now I'm going to show you a faster way to solve this equation. If you ever have that something is equal to a fraction, you can flip that something with the denominator really quickly. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to flip cosine 46 and X, and I promise you can do this. So now we'll just have that X is equal to 41 divided by cosine of 46. Now just compute cosine of 46 on a calculator. If you do that, you should get that is equal to 0.695. Now just do 41 divided by 0.695 on a calculator. You should get that X is equal to about 59. Give or take some rounding. But that is the answer to this problem. In this problem, we have a right triangle with side lengths of 25 and x and an angle between them of 23 degrees, and we need to solve for x. So first thing to do is label what 25 and x are. Are they adjacent, opposite, or hypotenuse sides relative to that 23 degree angle? And then we can figure out where to use cosine, sine, or tangent. So first, notice that the 25 is opposite to that right angle, therefore it is the hypotenuse. Now as for x, notice that x is the adjacent side relative to that 23 degree angle because it's right next to it. It makes up one of the sides of that 23 degree angle. So therefore, x is the adjacent side and 25 is the hypotenuse. Which trig function relates to the hypotenuse and the adjacent? Well, that sounds like cosine because we have SOH CAH TOA, and the CAH tells us that cosine is equal to adjacent over hypotenuse. So we're going to use cosine for this problem. So let's set up the cosine expression. Cosine of 23 degrees, that's the angle in this problem, is equal to A over H. Well, A is just x, and H is our hypotenuse, which is just 25. And we just need to solve for x now. First, multiply both sides by 25. That'll cancel out the denominator. Oops. Okay, as I was saying, that'll cancel out the denominator, and we'll leave x isolated on the right side. Now we just have 25 times cosine of 23. Do cosine of 23 on a calculator. If you do that, you will get that it is equal to 0.921. Now do 25 times 0.921 on a calculator, and you should get that x is equal to 23.03. And this is your answer, and we've solved for x now. That's it. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. Every subscription keeps this channel beating. Thanks for watching.